Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for logging into today's webinar. My name is TJ Cantwell, and I'm the Executive Director at the NCCCO Foundation. At the NCCCO Foundation, we are working to improve the crane industry for everyone working in the load handling field through research, education, and workforce development programs. You can learn more about the Foundation programs and future webinars at ncccofoundation.org. Today, as part of our educational webinar series, we'll be hearing a presentation entitled Understanding the Current State of Safety Hazards in the Crane Industry, which discusses the findings of recent research that was conducted in partnership between the NCCCO Foundation and the National Safety Council. We'll conduct a short Q&A at the end of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A box. We'll address as many as possible during the Q&A session. Please note that today's webinar is being recorded. By the end of our time today, we hope you will have a better understanding of the state of safety hazards in the crane industry from the perspective of certified crane operators based on the findings from our national survey. Our featured speaker today is Kathryn Crawford with the National Safety Council. Kate has an MS in industrial hygiene and a PhD in occupational and environmental health. She joined the National Safety Council in 2022 as the research manager for the Work to Zero initiative. With Work to Zero, Kate researches effective technology solutions to reduce workplace injuries and ways to integrate them into the workplace. Kate, thank you for joining us here today, and please go ahead and share your knowledge and the findings of our recent survey with this eager group.
Great, thank you, Jay. I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for everyone who came today to hear about this. We are going to talk about project that the National Safety Council has done in partnership with the NCCCO Foundation. The kind of first part of this research was a survey that TJ mentioned, so we'll get into that. So I'll start to give you all a little bit of background so you know where I'm coming from if you're not familiar with NSC or the Work to Zero initiative. Work to Zero is a grant-funded initiative within the National Safety Council. We're funded by the McElhatton Foundation, and our goal is eliminating fatality risks with technology. We really focus on serious injury and fatality prevention, and then also technology element comes into play. Our zero goal is backed with the mindset that everyone deserves to go to work and come home safely. And we look for solutions that can help ensure workers stay safe. So as you can see from these pictures, we've come a long way in how we approach safety and work towards mitigating, or even better yet, eliminating risks in the workplace. And so a lot of our work is focused on how to help employers adopt technology solutions that target specific workplace hazards. So project goals for this, again, so with support of and in partnership with the NCCCO Foundation, we wanted to focus on the role of crane operators and create materials to assist the industry with understanding their risks and how technology can be used to improve safety. So to kick off this project, we started with a national survey, and so this presentation is going to highlight our key findings. So this particular survey was adapted from past Work to Zero surveys that we've used to gather information from employers and employees across industries about workplace hazards, types of risks that are faced by workers, as well as the use or persons about safety technology solutions. So the NCCCO Foundation was able to bring their expertise and knowledge of the crane industry to help us adapt the survey to make it most relevant to crane operators. And so these are kind of the sections that how I've broken down the presentation. So we'll kind of dig into some of those top hazardous situations that we found, most frequent exposures. We'll look at situational risks as well as contributing factors, the tech solutions. And then we also ask questions about preferred training methods and needs for safety resources. A little bit of background into the actual kind of deployment and methodology of this. We launched this survey this summer. It was sent to the NCCCO mailing list, and we collected responses from July 12th to August 2nd. So it was open for about 3 weeks. We were looking for workers with active certifications that have worked in the last 2 years in jobs using those certifications. We had a fantastic response rate. I think this is one of the benefits from partnering with an organization like this, who has access to this audience and already has kind of a relationship with them and has been creating resources for them. So this was one of the highest response rates we've seen in a while. Had over 2,300 responses. We did screen out 150 people, didn't meet that eligibility criteria. So 14 who didn't have an active certification at the time of the survey, and then another 136 who hadn't been working in jobs using that certification in the past 2 years. So we still had over 2,100 participants that completed the survey. Participants were allowed to skip any questions that they wanted to, but if they got to the end and completed the survey, they were also eligible to be entered into a compensation raffle for a small Amazon gift card. So some information into the participants. So this, I think, shows that we had a really nice mix of respondents, both in age and geography. So you can see over on the left, we asked how long since you first obtained your certification. And we had people who have had it for less than a year, all the way to over 20 years. And then again, we asked about region, kind of recognizing that a lot of folks in this population are working at sites that may be in different states at times. And so in the past, the foundation has actually kind of broken up some regional some demographics regionally, and so we use that. But you can still see from this map the spread of where we got participants. Certainly the largest were in the South Central area, but that's also where we see the highest populations, like larger states, so compared to like the Northeast, for example. So really happy with that, a good mix of respondents. We also asked about primary industry. And so over 75% were in construction. I think we certainly expected that, but certainly that's where the majority of our folks came from. Also saw some in the utilities industries, manufacturing, mining, transportation, and warehouse. There was broken up into both maritime and non-maritime. Both came in at a little less than 1%. And then wholesale trade, that does include metals, recycling. So you have an idea of kind of what industries people were in. We also asked about primary role. So this was a select one option that best describes the work you're doing. So overwhelming response that primary role was operators. Again, something we were expecting. But we also had people who said that their role was best described as being site supervisors. Also had some riggers, trainers, signal persons, and some inspectors in there as well. We also asked about certifications, and we saw, again, the largest group kind of represented here was mobile crane operators. So close to 36% of our group had mobile crane operator certifications. And then you can see the breakdown. This is the list of all the certifications that were available with CCO. And then I will also say that 58% had multiple certifications. It was largely mobile crane operators plus at least one other thing. So again, in kind of talking with some of our subject matter experts, this was something we were kind of expecting, but a lot of multiple certifications as well. Anytime you have a survey, somewhat limited. These are self-reported survey responses, but I will say with such a high response rate, our margin of error was small. We were really happy to see so many people interested in participating in the survey. So we still got a lot of really good data. Limited ability to see differences between groups. I throw that out there. I don't think this is a huge limitation, but like I said, based on the numbers I just showed, we are mostly looking at people in the construction industry, mostly looking at operators. The multiple certifications comes into play because that made it a lot more difficult to kind of tease out some of these things we'll be looking at in terms of job risk by certifications. Still got a lot of great information. And I will say this is a very unique population. I mentioned earlier, looking at multiple job sites, potential to work in different states. also often doing other types of work, within the last few years, even if it's somewhat related to the certification, maybe they're doing other jobs on the site as well. I think we saw in some of our responses is that we're starting to kind of branch out, maybe less specific to actual crane operation, and to some other kind of more general construction type things, but we'll go through that. So the first section I'll go into is the job hazards. So we were looking at top hazardous workplace situations. So that's any situation where work is performed with the potential for a serious injury. We also looked at associated situational risks. So those types of risks are inherent to the situation, or I think the best way to think about it is like the kind of proximate cause of injuries. And then the systemic factors are things that contribute to those injuries, but are not a direct cause. And as I go through these, I think that'll probably make a little more sense. So for the top hazardous workplace situations, this graph or this figure that you're seeing here, this is based on past National Safety Council work. So the percentages and the situations that you're seeing here, we identified in past work. So going through BLS, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and CFOI data, looking at injury reports. And these are from a 2020 report. And so these are the top contributors to workplace fatalities that were non-roadway. So for instance, work at height down here at 23%, that means that working at height accounted for 20% of non-roadway occupational fatalities. So again, these are any situations where work is performed with the potential for an injury. So in our survey, the top situations that we saw were loading and unloading, vehicle pedestrian interactions, and working in height. So to start, loading and unloading materials, BLS considers this a worker activity. If we start breaking that down, if loading is the situation, the situational risk that might lead to injury might be crushed by a moving load. So that's something you see over on the left side. And the systemic contributor to that injury, but not a direct cause, could be something like fatigue. So if a worker is experiencing kind of a slower response rate because they're tired, a little bit impaired by being that tired, that's something that might contribute to it. So 89% of the respondents from this survey said that they were likely or very likely to be in this situation. The next one was vehicle and pedestrian interactions. So again, if we are considering that situation, the situational risk could be being struck by a vehicle, and then a contributor to that could be something like low visibility. So it's looking at these situations and then looking at the kind of pieces that play into what would actually cause an injury. And again, this survey, 64% of respondents said they were very likely or likely to be in this situation. Then working at height, again, if the situation is being at a height, working at height, our situational risk that could lead to an injury might be falling to a lower level or being struck by a falling object. And any kind of contributing factors to that, but not direct causes, could be something like adverse weather. And then 55% of respondents in this survey, again, said likely or very likely to be in this situation. So these were kind of far and away the top 3 situations where people said, yes, they're often in these situations. So then we also wanted to kind of dive into some of these situational and systemic risks. And so these, this slide, the next slide, it's going to look at the percentages of respondents who, again, said that they were very likely or likely to be exposed to these things when they're on the job site, doing these jobs, doing with their certifications. The gray bars at the top on the slide, gray is the systemic or the contributing factors, and then yellow is the situational. So I just wanted to kind of orient you to what's on the slide. I will just take a quick second to talk about heat stress, because I know this is like a really, feel like this is very notable when you look at this slide. 75% said we're very likely to be exposed to heat stress. When we talk about that, it's oftentimes talked about as an illness, not an injury. And so in this case, when we're talking about it, again, it's a contributing factor to an injury. And what we do know about working in hot environments, workers who are under heat stress, we know it contributes to injuries when we see things like sweaty palms that can cause someone to lose grip, or dog safety glasses that can cause trips. If someone's feeling a lot of heat stress and then starting to get dizzy, that can cause falls. And then certainly hot surfaces can cause burns, things like that. So in this sense, when we're talking about contributing factors to injuries, that's how we're talking about heat stress. So again, looking at the graph, that was certainly the top one, fatigue, another contributing factor. Those were the top two kind of most likely exposures that our respondents reported. But then we start seeing these situational ones, so direct causes of injuries, struck by falling object. A lot of, more than half said they would be in situations where that would happen. Also, equipment overturn and tipping. Certainly, I don't think these are going to surprise the crane industry. Lightning strikes, that was something that was suggested we add. I did not, that was not on my radar. I didn't realize how hot it might be. Contact with overhead power lines, struck by machinery and equipment, including a boom or a jib, and fall from height. So everything on this page was 50% or more of our respondents that was likely to happen. And this shows the breakdown of some remaining ones. So these are all 20 to 49%. But here's where we struck by vehicle, crane collapse, crushing, a couple different electrocution scenarios. Unfamiliar with site and surroundings, that's another contributing factor. That could come into play. We talked about people who are reporting to these different job sites. Lack of training, fairly low on the list, but certainly something that could come up. And then entangled in machinery. So then we also asked, we didn't just ask about, what are you likely to be exposed to? We said, in the past 2 years on your job sites, have you experienced a personal injury from any of these things? And then we also asked, has anyone on your job site experienced an injury to these things? That's what this slide is showing. The darker bars on the bottom are the personal injuries, and the lighter gray bars on the top of those stacked columns are injuries that were anywhere on the job site. So if we look at these situational ones, so again, kind of direct causes of injury, falling from height was the highest one that was reported. So 9% of our respondents experienced a personal injury due to a fall from height, and there was reports of 8 from just other job sites. So then we have struck by falling object, lightning strikes, struck by machinery or equipment, struck by vehicle, equipment overturn, and then crushing due to heavy equipment operation. We also asked about what were those contributing factors that again led to both personal or site-wide injuries. And so fatigue topped the list. 18% said fatigue contributed to a personal injury. Heat stress, 6 and 14. Lack of training, and being unfamiliar with their surroundings. We also wanted to try and dig into, we saw differences in any of these risks or any of these injuries by some of those descriptors that we pulled out in the beginning. So primary role, looking at, our operators, riggers, trainers, supervisors, are they experiencing these risks differently? Are they experiencing these exposures differently? And what could we pull out from there? And I will say kind of across the board, we saw a lot of similar patterns. So heat stress and fatigue, again, really topping those lists, and then kind of the same ones that we're seeing throughout. But some things to pull out here. So operators, fatigue and heat stress kind of top the board, but they're the only group that was reporting injuries from overturns or tipping. Riggers, had a higher reporting rate of being unfamiliar with site and surroundings. So this was what contributed to a personal injury. I'm not sure if I said that. So these are personal injuries by job role. And so riggers said that they reported higher injuries due to being unfamiliar with their surroundings than the other groups. For supervisors, perhaps interesting, they were the lowest group reporting issues with fatigue, but they were much higher than other groups when it came to reporting personal injuries due to being struck by falling objects. So I think sometimes we think about where the supervisor is on the job site, and if they're walking around, maybe perhaps they're at a higher risk for some of those things. And then trainers, perhaps something similar is happening there. We're seeing higher numbers for trainers being struck by vehicles. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I will say we had a much smaller group of trainers reporting on the survey. So when we get to the smaller groups, some of these injuries could be a little bit inflated, but that was something kind of that we pulled out. Just as a reminder, 85% of our respondents were operators, and then it gets much smaller throughout the other groups. We also tried to dig out some of that information, but looking at region. So across the US, are we seeing differences in these injuries or exposures? And again, we're seeing kind of the same top 5 lists, not a lot of changes there. But certainly South Central is reporting more heat stress. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'll throw up the map here just to remind you of where we're looking at. But so South Central, I don't know that that's going to surprise anyone. And then compared to the Northeast, we didn't have any reports of heat stress that led to any injuries. Also, South Atlantic had the highest rate of lightning strikes. Pacific, I think they kind of stand out there. They had the highest report for overturn injuries. Not sure exactly what that is. I think there's a lot of context that you can sift through to try and dig through some of this, but this is what we're seeing. But again, kind of across the board, throughout the country and throughout roles, we're seeing, the same kind of top hazards reported by this group. So some key takeaways, how to think about this. So we've asked questions about how likely is it that you're going to be exposed to this. We've asked about what actually ended up contributing to injuries. So this is one way to start looking at that data. I will say this looks similar to a lot of risk assessment tables that also look at severity of outcome. So I just want to emphasize that this is not taking into account severity of outcome. This is just looking at, if people said they were likely to experience it, and then also looking at injuries. So in this kind of top right box is where we're seeing things that both contributed to injuries, one of the top contributors to injuries, and was also reported as likely or very likely to be exposed to that. So that tells me that that is a priority area to look at. So what we were seeing in both places is people say, I'm often exposed to high heat environments. I also know it's contributed to injuries. So that's where I'm going to start prioritizing things. Fatigue, struck by falling object, lightning strikes, those were all in there. Conversely, kind of in this bottom left corner, that's where we see things that were both rated as unlikely to be in those situations. And we also didn't see a lot of injuries reported. That being said, entangled in machinery, any kind of electrocution, those are obviously very serious outcomes. So I don't in any way want to minimize how important it is to control for those situations. This is just kind of how we've organized the data we collected. And then going up to the top left, so those were things that people actually said they probably weren't as likely to be exposed to, but we know they led to injuries. So even if maybe you're not in that situation often, if you are, we definitely see some problems from it and adverse outcomes. So that's another important area to look at. So things like that were the fall from height, lack of training, struck by vehicle. And then the bottom right there would be the one people said they were very likely to be exposed to, but we didn't see a lot of injuries. We know injuries can happen with these things. But if we know our people are going to be in those situations, we still need to control that. That's what this figure is. I hope that makes a little sense thinking about how we're looking at combining this information. So the next section of the survey, we started talking about preparedness, policy, training. A lot of times these are also those kind of contributing factors, but we pulled out some information on this. And I would say overall, I mean, this slide to me is good news. We had a lot of people saying the blue on these pie charts are people that strongly agreed, and the blue is somewhat agreed. Anytime you see blue, it's people who are saying they agree. They're saying their supervisors identify safety issues. Their job sites are tracking and monitoring serious injuries, fatalities, near misses. Job sites have continuous improvement processes to reduce injuries. We asked job sites have comprehensive safety management systems. Are there policies and resources available to deal with these kinds of things? So overwhelmingly, we were seeing very similar results. A lot of people said, yes, absolutely, I'm getting that on the site, which is always a good sign. For digging into kind of reporting specifically, again, those blue wedges of the pie indicate agreement, and the dark blue ones are strongly agree. So my job sites encourage incident and near miss reporting. I always report incidents to my site supervisor. A little bit less, we see a drop, kind of a marked drop off here with reporting near misses. So that could be a room for improvement. But overall, seeing a lot of agreement with these statements. Near misses are important. That really gives companies, job sites, opportunities to identify hazards or weaknesses in their programs and correct them before someone actually does get injured. So always important to report near misses as well. More good news in terms of preparedness and policy, really high numbers here with this group, very confident that they can identify safety issues. One we always like to see is that there's high confidence for people who say they feel like they can stop work if they feel unsafe, and can discuss safety concerns with their supervisor. I think another one is over half said they strongly agree that they have access to appropriate training. And then certainly, when they're close to 30% said somewhat agree. So that's a majority of the population feels very prepared to do the work they're doing. We did ask about training preferences. We know the NCCCO Foundation provides a lot of education and resources, and we wanted to see what kind of preferences crane operators had to get their safety training. By far and away, in-person training on site was the most preferred. Again, maybe not a surprise, but always good to collect this data. Next was in-person training, but in the classroom. Online training came in kind of middle of the road, where we were seeing kind of more, a little bit more variance. Some people really like online training and some people don't. So we saw the most kind of discrepancy, but still came in middle of the line. And then visuals and videos are actually like very close side. Visuals were slightly higher, but those were the training preferences. We also asked some open-ended questions. So I don't think I mentioned that in the beginning, but we had a lot of different types of questions on the survey. So multiple choice and things like that, but also a lot of opportunities for some open feedback if people wanted to give it. And so for training preference, there was an option to give additional feedback. And what we saw a lot of in those were people said hands-on is always the best, no matter where it is. Then saw a lot about mentors and mentorship, which I thought was really interesting. So people saying that was one of the best ways that they learned was like kind of being assigned a mentor when they got to job sites to really learn with someone who had been through it. There were some comments about experienced instructors. Some of those had to do with, my best instructors were people who had done this and who had to react to safety hazards in the past, like in their line of work, and actually kind of talk through some of those things instead of just going through kind of a to-do list. Had a couple people talk about kind of group discussions and practices, so small group work. Even somebody talked about written tests. So that's not one we usually see, but just to kind of show kind of a wide range of preferences and how it's always good to offer training that will appeal to different styles of learners. I'm going to take a quick drink. So then getting into the next section of the survey, this is where we kind of start digging into safety technology. So are there technology solutions being used in the field? You know, what are they? If they're not being used, what are people's kind of awareness and attitudes towards them? Those are the kind of questions we asked. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide. We'll take a minute to go through this. So we asked about familiarity with safety technology. So we gave a bunch of technologies and let people say, you know, are they currently using this? Have they used it in the past, but are not currently using it? So currently using is in blue, used it in the past, but not currently is that green color. Orange is, I've heard of this being used at other job sites, but I haven't used it. And then gray is never tried or used this. And certainly, you know, the majority of our respondents haven't been using technology on the job site. So going through these, so wearable gas sensors, for those who aren't familiar with those, they alert workers to toxic gases, oxygen deficient areas, combustible atmospheres. I think we certainly see the largest familiarity with that. They have been around the longest, and we see a lot of use of those on construction sites and in utilities, manufacturing. There's a lot of uses for those. They've certainly been around a long time. And so we might not think about using it maybe specifically for crane operations. It wasn't kind of a surprise to know that that's where that kind of tech most people had used before. Proximity sensors, these are devices that detect objects in a set radius without physical contact. So you can put it on thing, it will alert when you're getting close to it without anything touching. The wearables, so kind of specifically for vital signs monitoring, that's something that can track worker well-being. It's especially used for heat stress, so in hot environments. There's also wearables that monitor fatigue, health issues, heart rate. Some of them also have real-time tracking and communication. So we see these used for lone workers. So if somebody's out by themselves, there's like fall detection capabilities, panic buttons if someone needs to get in touch with somebody, but they're far out. So wearables is a very kind of large group of tech. The camera analytics, so that's where cameras are used to kind of monitor environments. You can train them with AI and these predictive analytics, so it can recognize if there's a hazard present. They can be used to recognize, you know, if PPE is being worn, if there's a spill on the ground, kind of things like that. Drones, I think probably a lot of people, we're seeing drones so much just kind of in public life, not just work life now, that I'm sure most people are familiar with drones. These are unmanned vehicles that can be sent into hazardous areas instead of workers. The work zone intrusion detection, these are devices that will alert. You can link them to hardware or software, but so if someone enters a specific area, it will alert either like a command center or a worker themselves. Augmented reality, virtual reality, those are kind of the immersive computer-generated environments. We see those more used for training. And then location geofencing, that's similar to actual work zone intrusion. So that's like a wearable that an employee can wear when they enter a hazardous site that's been geofenced, which means it's been set up in advance. But if they walk into it, they'll get an alert, so they know they need to back out the area. And then robotics in the workplace, we see this a lot more with ergonomic risks, lifting materials, things like that, assembly, even in manufacturing. So again, I kind of already made the little caveat about the wearable gas sensors, kind of expected some familiarity there, also probably not tied directly to some of the crane stuff. So we'll pull out just the next kind of top three and we'll look at proximity sensors, the wearables, and the drones. And what we did is, so everybody in blue, everybody that said they're currently using technology, we asked them to give us feedback, so benefits and drawbacks. And so you'll see some of that on this slide. So again, the proximity sensors I talked about, the hazardous situations they mitigate. So that's the vehicle pedestrian interaction. So again, that was one of our top 3 that was highlighted in the beginning. That's something we know our crane operators are exposed to, those kinds of situations. And then the kind of specific risks for injuries are struck by a vehicle, crushed by a vehicle. Proximity sensors have been used to try and mitigate some of those risks. So they can reduce those interactions by detecting when a vehicle, there's a set proximity of the device to alert workers. So if somebody's working near it, so they can be alerted to it. And so again, we asked people that said they were currently using these on the job site, what they thought the benefits and drawbacks are. And so for benefits, we saw a lot of, well, they prevent collisions, they provide warnings and alerts, they reduce blind spots, they prevent damaged equipment and property, if they're preventing collision. Also, there were some comments about it increases awareness. You have a better sense of kind of how close things are or where you are in proximity to other things when you have these alerts. But then the drawbacks, we got a lot of really interesting feedback on folks who said there's too much dependency on these. We start waiting for the alarms and we stop kind of paying attention, or instincts, or like if we don't hear an alarm, we don't think it's a problem. Which is a problem. And then there was also comments about misuse. So if they're not set up properly, if you're not using it properly, false alerts. We had some comments that said weather could affect these, or debris. Comments about them being fragile, annoying, and distracting. That was something that came up, as well as cost. The next one we kind of will dig into a little bit. So with the drones, these can minimize or eliminate risks, but then they're used a lot for confined space entry, inspections, working at height. And then so the work at height is again one of those top situations for the crane operators, and falling from height are kind of specific injuries that they've been used to kind of address in the past. So they can eliminate some of these hazards if we remove the work from the height and use a drone instead, kind of thing. Again, so asking respondents who use these, only about 55 respondents were currently using drones on the job site. So again, over 2,000 respondents. We're not seeing a lot of tech use, but we do have some using them. So for drones, the benefits said there was a lot in there about improving job site visualizations, the things about being able to get bird's eye view, getting a really good hand on the area you're working, you're seeing all these things that you don't get to see. Aid inspections, that's something we see a lot with drones. They've kind of come a long way, and they can be equipped with a lot of new advanced cameras, sensors, imaging, lighting detection. So they have all these things that you can use with them that really help in inspections. There were comments in there about keeping employees away from hazards. Also comments in there about they were really helpful because they could take photos, which was really helpful for both record keeping and training. We saw comment that kind of hit on both those things, which I thought was really interesting feedback. The drawbacks, though, they're a distraction on the job site, not hands-on. There was some concern about invasion of privacy. So if you're up and looking at everything, what are they seeing? How are people using this information? There was some comments about, you can only use them in some areas. There are some restricted flight areas. So depending on where the job is, what the job is, they might not be able to be used. Cost, both purchase and maintenance, and that they require training. So the wearables, for this one, the hazard situations they mitigate, certainly the heat stress, and I'll just say thermal stress in general. So we've also seen these used for cold stress. Fatigue is a big one. I think those were the two the top kind of contributing factors we saw. So that's how the technology could be used to address those. I also included on here, I mentioned kind of in that one slide of the rundown, they can be used for down workers and lone workers and workplace violence. And I put those in here because some of the comments we got back from people who were using it, it seemed to kind of speak directly to those situations. So again, those that were using them, a little bit more than drones, about 66, still not a huge number. But those that did said benefit for monitoring health. A lot of actually comments about being able to monitor heart rate, can monitor stressors, things like that, mitigate fatigue. There was comments in there about they allow for faster response and treatment. So if that's going to alert you that something's wrong quicker than just figuring it out on your own, people were able to get treated quickly. And also there were some comments about tracking changes over time. So you can kind of see differences in how the workers are reacting, vital signs in different situations. Drawbacks, always, I think, top of the list for these is invasion of privacy. There's concerns about what data is being collected, how it's being stored, how it's being used. There was comments about if there's errors on wearables, comments about saying people weren't using them correctly, so they're not putting them in the right place, they're not doing what they're supposed to with them, and then you're not getting any kind of valid data from them. A lot of comments about how they get in the way and they can be a snag risk. So anytime you're wearing something like this, we worry about it getting in the way, causing any kind of getting stuck in something. Again, the kind of over-reliance on these devices was brought up. Someone brought up that they add heat and weight, which can be problematic. And then this was the one clearly kind of a tie back to the lone workers. As someone said, like they allow for workers to be alone, but they didn't think workers should be working alone. So kind of some interesting feedback there. The next piece of that is we asked about kind of perceptions of safety technology. So regardless if you're using it or not, you know, what do you think about using safety tech in the workplace? And I think overall, we saw some kind of high general acceptance for this. So, you know, this is showing like 78% of respondents said that they are open to trying new safety tech. And if they worked, you know, they would use them. And so digging into it a little bit more, you know, these questions. So our current safety equipment is meeting my needs, so it's not needed, or we haven't had a fatality in recent years, so I don't know what's necessary. So here we're kind of seeing maybe there's not, they're not perceiving huge need for this. About half think their needs are currently being met, but still some kind of agreement towards willingness to try. Again, kind of back supporting that general openness and willingness. So training on these technologies is more trouble than it's worth. Here, again, where the blue, the agreement, when we're seeing smaller amounts of blue, that means most people aren't agreeing with that. So they don't think it's more trouble than it's worth. On the right side with, I'm not comfortable with new technology, you know, I'm worried it'll be difficult for me to learn. We see a lot of people actually disagree with that. So something, you know, it doesn't seem like it's going to be, that doesn't seem like a barrier. There seems to be like some interest. It doesn't seem like it's going to be a big deal to learn it kind of things. So again, just certainly some willingness to adopt is what we're seeing here. Starting to see some concerns, again, when it comes to that collection of personal information. So heart rate, body temperature, is that a violation of privacy? Here we're seeing people saying, yes, I agree with that. Close to 40% are worried about privacy. 25%, you know, not really sure. And then over on the right side, you know, is utilizing a new technology going to slow me down or make me less efficient? Only about a quarter think it would. A third don't know. And I think that says a lot about the fact that people aren't using these techs. They're not sure what it would do. We did start seeing, when it comes to kind of perceptions of technologies here, we start seeing that, like, I'm not sure, piece of the pie grow a little bit. So, you know, I've been throwing a ton of information at you, so we'll try and sum up and do some key takeaways, recommendations to summarize this. So again, top hazardous work situations that this group was reporting: loading and unloading, vehicle pedestrian interactions, working at height. And it was 89% saying likely to be in that first group, 64% saying likely to experience the second, and 55% for the third. And just pulling it out again, when we look back at our data, all of these situations together accounted for 3% of non-roadway occupational fatal injuries. So we know that there's a lot of risk in these situations. If we know our people are going to be in those situations, we need to make sure we address them. And then that chart I showed earlier, kind of put that back up here, putting maybe some labels on these. So again, this top right corner, take action. That's where we're seeing the most likelihood of exposure, and also the top contributors to injuries. Still want to manage these other boxes where we're either seeing a lot of injuries or we're seeing a lot of exposures. But still, like I said, we're not going to forget to monitor these other things where we know there's still potential for injury, certainly some of which are very severe outcomes. Some key takeaways. So again, looking at the kind of safe culture type questions that we asked for this group, really high response rates related to having appropriate training before starting work, being confident about identifying safety issues, being confident able to stop work if there's a concern, confident they can discuss those concerns. Saw a lot of high response rates related to reporting injuries and working at job sites where that was a priority. Also working at job sites that prioritize just injury prevention in general, that have risk management systems in place to address injury prevention. And then also being open to trying these new kind of safety technology solutions. So moving into recommendations, I think, stuff we saw, the data gathered on training, it's continuing to provide great training for your workers and your operators and your certificants. In person, hands-on certainly is the most preferred, but again, kind of recognizing that people learn differently. And so having some different options, different varieties to really enforce some of these messages could be very beneficial. Encourage near-miss reporting. That's where we saw kind of the most market dropped off when it came to some of those safety, preparedness, and policy things. We're always reporting injuries. We're not reporting near misses a lot. Near miss reporting can really give you an idea of where you need to look, what you can do to prevent future injuries. If implementing safety technology and you're an employer, you want to absolutely establish a clear data policy up front. We saw the concerns that these workers had about some of those techs and how their data would be used. So we always recommend you be very upfront with how you're using that information and how you're not using that information. That's another important piece. And include operators at all stages and gather feedback. I think the open-ended responses and the feedback that we were getting from this, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, this is creating more risk for me, this is helping. I mean, that's really valuable feedback that only people on the ground can give you. And so it's really important to have them at every stage giving feedback and being part of that process. And I will say, I know this was a ton of information. We are putting together a summary report. We will certainly make that available for everyone who's interested in seeing it. That will be available soon. And kind of next steps for this research project. So we were able to identify people who said they were interested in talking more about their experience with technology for case studies. And so the ones we've done in the past, we look at, what is the hazard? What's the risk that we're addressing? What technology are you using to address it? And then what are the success stories and what are the lessons learned? So again, what's worked, what didn't work? How did we have to adapt? Did we have to abandon something and try something else? We really try to get all that information because since we get a lot of feedback, that's one of the most helpful things when you're looking, implementing this. And then the kind of full reports, state of safety and crane operations report, that's pulling in everything from the survey, from those qualitative interviews, also looking at kind of national injury statistics, seeing what's happening, being reported for injuries throughout the country. What can we dig out? Looking at overview technologies to decrease risk. So can we talk to solution providers about potential solutions? If these are our hazards, what are we doing to address it? How's it being used? Kind of a forecast for the future. And again, always our kind of key takeaways and recommendations. And with that, TJ, that's my slide. I'm happy to take questions if we've got some that have come in.
We do. Thank you very much, Kate. I really appreciate that. That was a lot of great information. So if you have any questions, we have a few minutes left. Please put it in the Q&A box there in the Zoom screen, and we'll get to many as possible. I have seen one or two questions about the availability of this information. As Kate mentioned, there will be an executive summary that will come out in the next few weeks, we'll say, as we develop it, and that will be a lot of this information will be included within that report. There will be a recording of this that will be available on the foundation website within the next couple of days. Again, you'll get an email related to that and a survey. We'll provide you a link to the survey and a link to the recording that will be available online. So again, we welcome you to do that. And then, as Kate also mentioned, there will be some follow-on information, larger report that's to come, case studies and larger report that's to come probably later this year and early 2024. So for all those who want to get more information, there will be ways to get at it that way. So some questions that have come through here, were there differences in technology acceptance by age or years of experience? Were you able to tell that?
That is a great question. And I need to go back and look through that. That is certainly going to be in the report. I don't have that off the top of my head, and I apologize for that. In general, not stark differences. When we look at like substantial, significant differences, we weren't necessarily seeing anything like that, but I'll certainly make sure that we include that in the report.
Great, thank you. There's also a request here that in the report, if the statistics related to the training preferences would also be of interest to folks too. So something to note.
Absolutely.
There's a question here related. What technologies do you think hold the most potential for improving crane safety? Or is that part of the next discussion?
I think it's part of the next discussion, because I think we need to do some more work really digging into the risks and then talking about like who's been using it for what. So we've gotten some of that feedback on the initial, like this is what worked, this is what didn't work. The ones I highlighted, that's where we see a lot of initial potential. So certainly the proximity sensors, because we know people are reporting a lot of struck by vehicles and the vehicle pedestrian interactions, but we also know there's limitations there, especially with cranes. Sometimes they're not working with these like great heights kind of thing. So I think we need to do a little more work to really pull out that later report is going to look at. I think essentially for the work zone intrusion detection could have a lot of potential. A ton of feedback, especially in the open responses, that people said they were most worried about people going into areas where they weren't supposed to be. And it was usually maybe people that weren't working directly with. And so finding a way to make these sites less accessible, warning people as soon as there's someone in there, if someone's in your blind spot, finding some kind of alert. So I think the work zone intrusion or the location geofencing has a lot of potential there. And we didn't really dig into that one much here because no one was really using it. So that's certainly on the list that for the next report is talking to more people who may be using it and talk to solution providers and seeing what's practical.
Other question. When was the survey conducted? Was it conducted in the summertime? And if so, would that potentially impact the high rate of heat stress that was reported?
Yeah, that is a great point. So the survey was put out July, right? Mid-July, beginning of August. So we're talking one of the hottest times of the year, and we sent that out. We did frame the questions as when answering these questions, think about you worked on at the job site over the past 2 years, trying to get at kind of anything that contributed to things. So ideally, if we ask that question again in the winter, we would still get the same responses. That being said, I recognize even if I took a survey, what comes closest to the top of mind is what's happening right outside the door. So yeah, it could certainly be something that was more people were more aware of since we sent it, at the end of July. Yeah, that's a good point.
Are there any tips for introducing wearables to the workforce? I worry about employee pushback.
That's a great question. That's something we've heard about a lot. Again, wearables are the ones where we see kind of the most concerns. I think a lot of the times, if you have a good safety culture in place, we see less problems. If your workers aren't trusting what you're going to do with their data, that could mean that there's some other problems going on. But again, we talk about establishing data policies, being very clear about this is what we're using it for, this is how we're not going to use it, showing them what gets collected. We worked with one employer who was doing some pilots where they just had screens. They did like a lunch and learn and had screens up that says, this is what we're collecting off of you. This is how we're going to use it. This is how it can help. And another thing we recommend is having people, again, involved at every stage of that process. So when you're looking at tech, when you're talking about it, get feedback from them up front, find out what the concerns are, address them early on. And throughout the process, kind of keep going with it. You can find like digital champions. So, if you can find the workers who are really on board and think it's a great idea, have them get involved, have them talk to coworkers about it. But it's not always an easy solution. It does take time, certainly, to get employee buy-in.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to sink in a couple of quick ones here. We just got another minute or so. Do you see subcontractors that were unaware of the OSHA ground conditions requirement by the controlling entity and suffering mobile crane overturns due to poor ground conditions? That's a very specific question, but I think related to kind of the overturns and those kind of things that happen with cranes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's not something I can say I can pull out from this data. I think that's a really interesting comment, though, and something we could try to dig into maybe in like the interviews, the qualitative interview stage, if we're talking to people who are dealing with that, see if that comes into play. It's a really interesting point.
And one final question here. Has the trend of acceptance of technology grown very recently? The age and experience gap is either nearest retirement or in the 1 to 5 year demographic. It says in our area, we have a large amount of retirees, so we are seeing more positive response to tech mentioned. Have you seen any of that?
We have seen some of that. And it's also one of the things that we talk about is we're seeing this technology in so many places outside of work. I don't have the numbers on me. Like the sheer number of people that own drones just for fun. My boss is always saying she has an 11-year-old son. There's like 3 drones in her house. We see technology being used in these other situations. We have some of these apps on our cell phones, in our cars. We have these camera analytics, we have wearables, things like Fitbit. We're seeing so much of it used outside of work that I think we're seeing more acceptance in work because people have been kind of already introduced in other situations.
Thank you. So I want to be conscious of time. So before we sign off, I just want to thank you again, Kate, for all the information you provided, and NSC for the partnership on this, and ask everybody to keep an eye out for future webinars and announcements from the NCCCO Foundation. Our next webinar will be on November 30th, and will feature a panel of excellent female crane operators who will share their personal experiences and advice for those who want to pursue an exciting career as a crane operator. Registration and details will be shared via email, LinkedIn. As I said, you will also receive an email shortly regarding survey to get your feedback on this webinar, as well as a link to be able to access the recording of this on our website. We do welcome your feedback and any of your thoughts about future potential webinars. Thanks again, Kate, and thanks everyone for joining us and participating in the NCCCO Foundation's webinar on this important topic. We really appreciate you signing in and hope to see you next time.